Welcome to another special episode of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. So this is a special episode. That's all I'm doing now is special episodes because we've already finished the Gospel of Matthew. We did that in 67 episodes. If this is the first thing you're listening, if you just found this podcast and this is the first episode you're listening to, I encourage you to go back to episode 1. In a lot of podcast platforms, that means you'll have to scroll all the way to the beginning, which is better than my phone. For some reason, in my phone, it throws them all over the place. They're not in any order. But unless you're using my phone, apparently. I haven't seen anyone else's phone like that. But if you're using a regular sane phone or computer or something, you'll probably have to scroll back to the beginning to get to episode 1. But that's where we start if you want to go through the Gospel of Matthew. So now I'm just doing special episodes. And what I'm doing today is that I'm filling in a gap here because I missed something when we were going through the Gospel of Matthew. I don't know if you noticed. I don't know if you were paying attention, but apparently I wasn't paying attention. I missed verse 17 of chapter 1. How did that happen? I missed verse 17. Actually, I realized it fairly early on. I'm not sure how early. It was definitely after I'd done the second episode and I'd already missed it. So the first episode was verses 1 through 16 of the first chapter of Matthew. And then the next episode, I started with verse 18. I just skipped over verse 17. And I'm not sure when I realized it. I remember it was early on, but I think I'd already done several episodes. And then I realized I never did 17 because 17 is actually kind of interesting. It's really important. And you can do a whole episode on that one verse. So I'll read it. Let's read this. This comes right after the genealogy. That was the first episode, the genealogy. And then verse 17, which is a really interesting verse. And it reads like this. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Now it's numbers, and I know some people are intimidated by numbers, but you're not going to have to be good at math for this, or at least not much. There's a little bit of math involved, but it's not much. Mostly it's symbolism, and it's kind of fun. So 3 sets of 14 generations. What does this mean? Why is this important? There is a Bible scholar that's done a podcast on this, Dr. Timothy Lewis. And he has done a podcast called Matthew-linity. Matthew-linity. And that is a play on the words Matthew and masculinity. Because his theory, as I understand it, what he is suggesting is that the Gospel of Matthew reframes masculinity. Which I think that's kind of part of what Matthew is doing. I think he's right. If you listen to my podcast, you'll see how that, there are these sort of feminist trajectories. One way to understand it, because it's still mostly about men. Jesus is a man. The 12 disciples are men. Now at the end, it's like the women who don't run away, who stay and who are fearless. But the Messiah is still portrayed as a man, and so one way to understand this, it comes out of a highly patriarchal society. I would argue more patriarchal than our modern society today. Somebody could argue with me on that, but that's what I think. And I think that the Gospel of Matthew has these feminist trajectories. I've talked about them, the women that don't run away, the fact that Jesus is anointed at the hands of a woman, which is in all 4 Gospels. And there are other, and then in the genealogy that comes right before verse 17 that we read, Go back to episode 1 on this, and you'll find that what's important in the genealogy is the 5 women. They are the key to understanding the genealogy. So you can look at them as feminist trajectories, subtle uplifting of women, or sort of the message. There's a subtle message that women show the way, that they are the model disciples, right? The model students of Jesus, the Messiah. But it's still within a highly male story, from a patriarchal time and place. And so another way to understand it is it's redefining masculinity. So I think Dr. Lewis is I think he's right about that. If he's listened to my podcast, so he may hear this. If I got it wrong, let me know. I will retract, but I'll try to correct it. But that's what he says. So I'd encourage you, if you really want to dig into a lot of this, especially in the genealogy and in the beginning of Matthew 1, go to his podcast. And so for verse 17, he has 14 possibilities for what the number 14 symbolizes. Very clever. I'm not going to get into all of those, but I am drawing some from him, some from Warren Carter, some from Charles Talbot. And so here it is. So one thing that there's 3 sets of 14. The one thing you have to realize is that there actually aren't 3 sets of 14, and it's not that verse 17 is lying to us, but it's that this is a symbolic text. Now, most of us probably weren't counting, but if you go through the genealogy, there's actually 2 sets of 14 and then 1 set of 13 names in the genealogy. There's not 3 sets of 14. But, if you go back to episode 1, I made this point before, that this is a symbolic text. And like Rahab, the second woman in the genealogy, who's very important, but there's no indication outside of Matthew 1 that she is part of this lineage. And in fact, the author of Matthew sticks Rahab in the wrong century. She's not even in the right century. So, because she's in there for symbolic reasons. This is a symbolic text. It's not supposed to be, exactly accurate. And there's a way you can make it into 3 sets of 14. I mean, not really, but because the last one in each previous set gets a set again in the new set of 14. If you go through the genealogy, that's what happens. So the first set of 14 generations ends with David, and then David gets repeated again when we start the second set of 14, or the same with Jeconiah. Jeconiah is the last one in the second set of 14, but when we start with the third set of 14, Jeconiah gets said again. So and the second and third set are sort of, that's the most obvious separation, because they're separated by the mention of the exile, the deportation to Babylon. And so Jeconiah's name gets said on both sides of that statement. And then so if you count him again, then you get 14 names in the third set. So you have 14, 14, and 14. But who cares? Because this is just symbolic. Just take it. 17, verse 17 says there's 3 sets of 14 in the generation. There's something to that. So what is it? Well, one very popular interpretation or reason that is given is that the name for David in Hebrew, when they attach numerical values to the letters, if you add up, which this was a common thing to have a to add up the letters in a name or a word and then give that word a value. This was very common in the ancient world. And in Hebrew, if you add up the numerical values of the name David, you get 14. So, and David is, he's sort of the central father of the genealogy, although there's something very interesting there if you go back and listen to episode 1. But he's the central father of the genealogy. He's also mentioned in the first verse before the genealogy begins. And then Jesus is often called the son of David. Now, of course, this is, listen to the whole podcast, listen to episode 1 and the whole podcast, because Jesus' relationship to David is very interesting. But that's what some people think. It's about David. I think it's a possibility. And by the way, not, there could be multiple reasons for 14 being named here in chapter 17. These are not all mutually exclusive. So that's one. But another thing, one thing Dr. Lewis says, the way he says it, is that 14 was sort of considered a round number. That seems strange to us, but for us, 10 is a round number, right? 20 is a round number. Even 15 is more round than 14. But in the ancient world, lots of things were numbered in 14. And so it was kind of a round number. And so you get sometimes generations that are talked about in sets of 14. So the Hebrew scriptures speak of generations in sets of 14 sometimes, and the Mishnah, which is rabbinic literature from the 2nd century AD or CE, the Mishnah speaks of generations of rabbis in sets of 14, and Jesus is portrayed as a rabbi. And even Dr. Lewis points out that even in the Greco-Roman world, in the philosophical traditions of the Greco-Roman world, philosophical teachers in these philosophical traditions were spoken of, their generations, the generations of these teachers were spoken of in sets of 14. So it didn't have to be people that were blood related. This could be generations of rabbis or generations of teachers, and rabbi was basically a teacher, right? So both in the Greco-Roman world and in Israel, 14 was a number like that was used for generations of familial generations and generations of teachers. Let me read you what Charles Talbert says in his commentary on Matthew about verse 17. He says, the number 14 was conventional in genealogies. In 1 Chronicles 1-2 are 14 generations from Abraham to David. In 2 Baruch 53-74, world history is divided into 14 periods from Adam to the Messiah. And in the Mishnah tractate Avot 1-12 are 14 links in the chain of tradition between Moses and the last pairs of teachers. So this would have been actually pretty common. It doesn't mean it doesn't symbolize anything. I still think it symbolizes something. It has, but 14 people would have expected that. So now what I have always thought, even before I listened to Dr. Lewis and read Charles Talbert and others and Warren Carter, is that it had to do with Sabbath. Because when I read through it, I immediately recognized that 3 sets of 14 is 6 sets of 7, right? And what does that mean? 6 sets of 7 is 1 short of 7 sets of 7. And 7 sets of 7 is the Super Sabbath, right? The Jubilee, the 49th year, the Jubilee, the Super Sabbath. Leviticus 25. If you know anything about Sabbath legislation, there's the Sabbath day, there's the Sabbath year, and then there's the Super Sabbath year, the 7 times 7 years. So Symbolically, this would mean that there are 6 sevens, 6 Sabbaths before Jesus comes along, and the generation of Jesus, or Jesus' story, the gospel, is the 7th Sabbath. It is the Jubilee, the Super Sabbath. And that is the time when society is reordered. That's the time of liberation. Debt slaves are set free. All debts are canceled. It's a time of liberation and reordering of society, which is a lot of what the gospel is about. Jesus talks about debt cancellation. In Luke, Jesus even refers to his ministry as the Jubilee year. So that's what makes most sense to me, is that Jesus' story, the gospel, the story of Jesus, is the Jubilee liberation, the reordering of society, the beginning of reordering of society. The church begins to speak prophetically this word of reordering the society and proclaiming the Jubilee year, the 7th seven of the Super Sabbath. So that's what makes most sense to me. Now, something else that Dr. Lewis mentions, now he gives 14 possibilities. I'm not getting into all of those. And there's, one in Daniel 9 that a lot of people talk about, which is 77s of years. But I'm not going to get into that. But another possibility that Lewis mentions, which is intriguing to me, is that Rome thought of the world that it was conquering for its empires. That they referred to the rest of the world, or this world that they were conquering, or that they had conquered, as the 14 nations. The 14 nations. And there's a sort of parallel in Acts when the story is telling us, the author's telling us about the first Pentecost, right? And that the people are speaking all these different languages, but they are speaking the language of Judea plus 14 other languages. So there seems to be in the New Testament, like there's a lot of parallels, but they're not really parallels. They're sort of counter examples of Rome's imperialism, but in the Gospels, in the New Testament, it's done without weapons. And it's not, they aren't conquering by the sword, they are conquering through the prophetic word spoken up through their mouths, the sword that proceeds from the mouth. That's the rhetoric of the New Testament. And the message that they are proclaiming is this upside down society. So Rome is conquering through violence, through the sword that's held in the hand, and it is imposing this top-down patriarchal order on the world, whereas the Jesus movement is proclaiming a message through the prophetic word, the sword that proceeds from the mouth, and it's an upside-down ordering of society where the first are last and the last are first. And, as Dr. Lewis is suggesting, and I think he's right, masculinity is redefined. Women are held up as although it's subtle in the texts, women are held up as the model disciples, and men need to be like women. So it's the first are last, the last are first. The outsiders are brought to the center. Inside is outside. It's a complete reordering of society. It's the great jubilee, the great liberation. This is the message of the church. This is the prophetic word, the sword that proceeds from the mouth. This is how the church conquers. And so you get that at the end of Matthew. At the end of Matthew, you get the Great Commission. And if you listen to my last episode 67, the last episode about Matthew, there's a parallel between the Great Commission and Rome's statements of how it conquers the world. And so the Great Commission sort of subverts that, sends people out with a teaching, not a sword, a subversive teaching of reordering society, turning it upside down. That is the message, the way they conquer. So that's intriguing. 14 is how Rome understood the rest of the world that we're conquering. And we see that parallel in Acts at Pentecost. And maybe that's what part of what Matthew was thinking. I don't know. That's an intriguing parallel. But what I really settle on is that 14 was considered a round number. I like that part of what Lewis was presenting. 14 is considered a round number, was used in generations and counting generations in the Hebrew Bible, and then also was used in both rabbinic and Greco-Roman literature to talk about generations of teachers, because Jesus was a teacher. So I think all that plays into it. And then mostly that Jesus is the seventh seven, that his story, the story of the gospel, is the Jubilee, it's the super Sabbath, the seventh seven, the time of liberation. That is, I think, what makes most sense to me. So thank you for listening. And again, if this is the first thing you've listened to, then please go back and listen to episode 1 going forward. In all of those, all the regular episodes, I scripted it. So some of these special episodes I just do free form like this. I just talk and then I go back and edit, and hopefully it makes sense. But the rest of them were scripted, so they're hopefully it's better. But hopefully you enjoyed this too. So thank you for listening, and grace and peace to you and your household.